The morning fog hung thick over the Willamette River as Marcus Chen adjusted his coffee cup holder and merged onto Interstate 84, heading into downtown Portland for another mundane Tuesday at the accounting firm. The radio droned on about traffic delays and a storm system moving in from the Pacific, but Marcus barely listened, his mind already cataloging the stack of tax returns waiting on his desk. At 32, he had settled into the comfortable rhythm of middle management, a routine as predictable as the Oregon rain that would inevitably start falling by afternoon. His Honda Civic hummed along steadily in the right lane, windshield wipers occasionally squeaking against the mist that seemed to perpetually coat everything in the Pacific Northwest. Marcus had grown up in this city, watching it transform from a sleepy river town into a bustling tech hub, but somehow he had never quite found his place in either version. His parents, first-generation immigrants from Taiwan, had instilled in him the values of hard work and keeping his head down, advice that had served him well in climbing the corporate ladder, but had left him feeling increasingly invisible in his own life. His ex-wife Sarah used to tease him about being too cautious, too afraid to take risks, criticisms that stung with their accuracy even after their divorce 2 years earlier. Now he lived alone in a modest apartment in the Hawthorne district, his weekends filled with Netflix binges and the occasional hike in Forest Park when the weather cooperated. The traffic began to slow as he approached the Morrison Bridge, a daily bottleneck that usually gave him time to mentally prepare for the day ahead. Construction crews had been working on the bridge approaches for months, reducing 4 lanes to 2, and creating the kind of backup that made commuters curse the city planners. Marcus reached for his travel mug, noting absently that he would need to stop for more coffee before the afternoon meetings, when a commotion in his peripheral vision caught his attention. 2 lanes over, in the left-hand lane that had been moving slightly faster, a silver sedan was weaving erratically, its driver apparently struggling to maintain control. The sedan, a late-model Nissan Altima with Washington plates, was drifting toward the concrete barrier that separated the roadway from the sidewalk and the river beyond. Marcus watched with growing concern as the vehicle struck the barrier with a grinding scrape of metal on concrete, bounced back into traffic, and then careened forward again. Other drivers were honking now, some pulling into the shoulder to avoid the unpredictable path of the struggling car. Through the sedan's rear window, Marcus could make out the silhouette of the driver, slumped forward over the steering wheel in a way that suggested medical distress rather than intoxication. The Altima struck the barrier again, this time with enough force to breach the concrete and metal railing. Time seemed to slow as Marcus watched the silver car tip forward, its front end disappearing over the edge of the bridge. The vehicle hung there for a moment, balanced precariously on the twisted remains of the barrier, before gravity claimed it entirely. The sedan plunged 30 feet toward the dark waters of the Willamette River below, its descent marked by the sickening sound of crushing metal and shattering glass as it struck the water nose first and immediately began to sink. Marcus had pulled his Civic to the shoulder without conscious thought, his hands moving independently of his paralyzed mind. Around him, other commuters were stopping as well, cell phones already pressed to their ears as they called 911. But emergency responders were miles away, stuck in the same traffic that had brought them all to this moment, and the silver sedan was disappearing beneath the surface of the river with alarming speed. The current was stronger than it appeared from the bridge, swollen by recent rains that had swelled tributaries throughout the watershed, and Marcus could see that the car would be completely submerged within minutes. He was out of his car and running toward the gap in the barrier before he fully understood what he was doing, his body operating on instincts he did not know he possessed. Behind him, voices called out warnings and questions, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Marcus reached the twisted metal of the destroyed railing and looked down at the river below, where the silver sedan was now more than halfway submerged. The driver's side window had somehow remained intact, and through the water-streaked glass he could see the driver, an elderly woman, unconscious, and trapped by her seatbelt as the river rushed in around her. But it was movement in the back seat that made Marcus's blood run cold. A small dog, what looked like a golden retriever mix, was paddling frantically in the rising water, its head barely above the surface as it struggled against the current flowing through the broken rear window. The animal's eyes were wide with terror, and Marcus could hear its distressed whimpering even over the sound of rushing water and gathering crowd on the bridge above. The dog was young, maybe 2 years old, with a red collar that suggested it was someone's beloved pet, not a stray caught in a random tragedy. Marcus kicked off his dress shoes and shrugged out of his suit jacket, his accountant's mind automatically calculating odds and probabilities, even as his body prepared for action. The water would be shockingly cold, probably in the low 50s even in late spring, cold enough to trigger hypothermia within minutes. The current was strong enough to sweep him downstream before he could reach the car, and even if he made it, there was no guarantee he would be able to get inside or back out again. His swimming skills were adequate, but not exceptional, honed during childhood lessons at the local YMCA, but not tested in real-world conditions for over a decade. Yet none of these rational concerns seemed to matter as much as the sight of that terrified dog, alone and drowning in the back seat of a sinking car. Marcus had never owned a pet himself, his practical nature balking at the responsibility and expense, but something about the animal's helpless struggle cut through every logical objection. Maybe it was the memory of his childhood friend's dog, a gentle golden retriever named Buddy, who had been Marcus's constant companion during the difficult years when his parents worked double shifts and he spent long afternoons alone. Maybe it was the recognition that this was a moment when all his careful planning and risk assessment meant nothing, when the only choice that mattered was between action and inaction. Marcus climbed through the gap in the barrier and jumped. The 30-foot fall seemed to last forever, wind rushing past his face and the river rushing up to meet him. He hit the water feet first with an impact that drove the breath from his lungs and sent shock waves of cold through his entire body. The Willamette in spring was fed by snowmelt from the Cascade Mountains, and the frigid water was like being plunged into liquid ice. For a moment, Marcus sank beneath the surface, disoriented and gasping. Before his survival instincts kicked in and he fought his way back to the air, the current was even stronger than he had anticipated, immediately pulling him downstream from where the sedan continued its relentless descent toward the river bottom. Marcus fought against the flow, his dress shirt and slacks creating drag that made every stroke a struggle. His muscles were already beginning to cramp from the cold, and he could feel his core temperature dropping with each passing second. Above him on the bridge, he could hear voices shouting instructions and encouragement, though the words were lost in the rush of water and the pounding of his own heart. The sedan was almost completely submerged now, only the rear bumper and part of the trunk still visible above the surface. Marcus reached the vehicle just as the last air bubbles escaped from the interior, and he took a deep breath before diving beneath the surface to find a way inside. The rear window had been shattered by the impact, creating an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through if they were willing to risk the jagged edges of broken glass. Yonder water, the car was a tomb of twisted metal and floating debris, everything rendered strange and alien by the green-filtered light that penetrated the river's murky depths. Marcus found the dog first, no longer paddling but floating motionless near what had been the ceiling of the back seat. For a terrifying moment he thought he was too late, that the animal had already drowned in the few minutes it had taken him to reach the car. But when he grabbed the dog's collar and pulled it toward him, he felt a weak heartbeat against his palm. The retriever was unconscious but alive, its body limp and unresisting, as Marcus maneuvered them both toward the broken window. His lungs were beginning to burn from lack of oxygen, and dark spots were creeping in at the edges of his vision. Getting out of the car proved even more difficult than getting in had been. The dog's dead weight made it nearly impossible to navigate through the narrow opening, and twice Marcus had to surface for air, leaving the unconscious animal floating inside the submerged vehicle while he gasped and tried to summon the strength for another attempt. On his third dive, he managed to work the dog's body through the window, accepting deep cuts on his arms and shoulders from the broken glass in exchange for their freedom. The retriever's golden fur was dark with river water and blood, but Marcus could still feel that faint, precious heartbeat. Breaking the surface with the dog in his arms, Marcus found himself surrounded by chaos. Emergency responders had finally arrived, and firefighters were lowering a rescue basket from the bridge, while paramedics prepared to receive survivors. The crowd of spectators had grown to dozens of people, all of them focused on the drama playing out in the river below. Marcus could hear sirens in the distance, and the thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the east, probably news crews alerted by the first responders' radio traffic. But his attention was focused entirely on the small, still form in his arms. The dog's eyes were closed, and Marcus could not tell if it was breathing. He had learned CPR years ago as part of a workplace safety training, but he had never had to use it, and certainly had never attempted it on an animal. Still, the basic principles had to be the same. Marcus tilted the dog's head back to open its airway, checked its mouth for obstructions, and began rescue breathing, sealing his mouth over the animal's snout and forcing air into its lungs. The first few breaths produced no response, and Marcus felt a crushing despair settle over him. He had risked everything to save this dog, had probably given himself hypothermia, and who knew what other injuries, and it was going to die anyway. But then the retriever's chest began to rise and fall on its own, and river water started pouring from its mouth and nose. The dog's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive, and it made a weak sound that was part cough and part whimper. Marcus pulled the animal closer against his chest, sharing what little body heat he had left while they waited for rescue. The firefighters' basket reached them within minutes, though it felt like hours to Marcus, who was struggling to stay conscious as hypothermia began to shut down his body's systems. Strong hands pulled him and the dog up out of the water, voices calling out medical information and instructions that he could barely comprehend. The last thing he remembered clearly was being loaded into an ambulance, the dog wrapped in blankets beside him, both of them shivering uncontrollably as paramedics worked to stabilize their vital signs. Marcus woke up in the emergency room at Oregon Health and Science University, his body wrapped in heated blankets and connected to various monitors that beeped and hummed around his hospital bed. His first coherent thought was about the dog, and he tried to sit up to ask about its condition before a nurse gently pushed him back down. The woman, whose name tag identified her as Janet, smiled warmly and assured him that the dog was alive and being treated by veterinarians at the nearby animal hospital. The golden retriever had suffered from near drowning and hypothermia, just like Marcus, but the prognosis was good for both of them. The story of the rescue had already begun to spread beyond the immediate scene at the bridge. Someone in the crowd had captured video of Marcus jumping from the bridge and pulling the dog from the sinking car, and within hours the footage was circulating on social media, with captions calling him a hero. Local news stations picked up the story for their evening broadcasts, interviewing witnesses who described his selfless actions in terms that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. He had never thought of himself as brave or heroic, and the attention felt overwhelming after a lifetime of cultivating invisibility. The elderly woman who had been driving the sedan, a 73-year-old retired teacher named Dorothy Williams, had suffered a stroke while driving across the bridge. She had survived the crash and was in stable condition in the ICU. Her family gathered around her bedside to wait for signs of recovery. Dorothy's daughter Susan came to Marcus's room later that evening to thank him for saving her mother's dog, a 5-year-old golden retriever named Charlie, who had been Dorothy's constant companion since her husband's death 3 years earlier. Susan explained that her mother would have been devastated to lose Charlie, that the dog had been the thing that kept her going through the loneliness and depression that followed her husband's passing. Over the next few days, as Marcus recovered from his ordeal and tried to process what he had done, the story continued to grow. The video of the rescue had been viewed millions of times, shared across every social media platform with hashtags like Heroic Rescue and Everyday Hero. News outlets from around the country picked up the story, describing Marcus as a mild-mannered accountant who had risked his life to save a stranger's dog. Interview requests poured in from television shows and podcasts, all wanting to talk to the man who had jumped from a bridge to save an animal he had never met. Marcus struggled with the sudden fame, feeling like the person being described in the news reports was someone else entirely. The heroic figure in the stories was confident and brave, someone who acted without hesitation to save others, while Marcus saw himself as someone who had simply done what needed to be done in that moment. He had not calculated the risks or weighed the options, had not made a conscious decision to be heroic. He had simply seen a living creature in distress and acted to help, the same way he might have helped an elderly person cross the street or picked up litter in a park. But the public response suggested that such actions were far from ordinary. Letters and emails arrived at his office and home address, sent by people from across the country who wanted to thank him for showing that there were still good people in the world. Children sent drawings of him rescuing the dog, and animal rescue organizations invited him to speak at fundraising events. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent most of his adult life trying to blend into the background, and Marcus found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. The most profound change came in his relationship with Charlie the dog and Dorothy Williams. As Dorothy recovered from her stroke, she asked to meet the man who had saved her beloved companion, and Marcus found himself spending hours at her bedside, listening to stories about her late husband and the life they had built together. Dorothy was a retired elementary school teacher who had dedicated her career to helping children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and her quiet strength and wisdom reminded Marcus of his own grandmother, who had passed away when he was in college. Charlie, meanwhile, seemed to remember Marcus as his rescuer. The golden retriever would become excited whenever Marcus visited, tail wagging and body wiggling with joy at the sight of the man who had pulled him from the sinking car. Dorothy joked that Charlie had better manners with Marcus than he did with most people, always sitting quietly and resting his head on Marcus's lap as if seeking comfort from the trauma they had shared together in the river. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to see changes in himself that went far beyond his newfound public recognition. The experience of risking his life for another living creature had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of purpose and connection that his careful, cautious existence had never provided. He started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends, helping to care for abandoned and injured pets while they waited for new homes. The work was physically demanding and emotionally challenging, but it gave him a satisfaction that his accounting career had never delivered. His relationship with his ex-wife Sarah also began to evolve in unexpected ways. She reached out to him after seeing the news coverage, admitting that she had been wrong about his capacity for courage and selflessness. Their conversations, first tentative and awkward, gradually became more honest and open as they explored what had gone wrong in their marriage and whether there might be a path forward. Sarah had always criticized Marcus for being too risk-averse, too focused on security and stability to truly live. But the man who had jumped from a bridge to save a drowning dog was clearly capable of taking risks when it mattered. The media attention eventually died down, as it always does, replaced by news stories and different heroes. But the impact of that morning on the Morrison Bridge continued to ripple through Marcus's life in ways both large and small. He had discovered that he was capable of extraordinary actions when circumstances demanded them, that the careful, cautious person he had always been was not the sum total of who he could become. The experience had broken something open inside him, a shell of self-limitation that had kept him small and safe, but also isolated and unfulfilled. Dorothy Williams made a full recovery from her stroke, defying her doctor's initial predictions and returning home to her small house in southeast Portland. She and Marcus became close friends, bound together by their shared trauma and their mutual love for Charlie, who seemed to thrive on the expanded social circle that had resulted from his near-death experience. Dorothy insisted that Marcus join her for Sunday dinners, events that gradually expanded to include other neighbors and friends who had been drawn into their orbit. These dinners became a highlight of Marcus's week, filling his apartment with the aromas of Dorothy's cooking and his heart with the warmth of genuine human connection. The conversations around Dorothy's dining table ranged from politics to philosophy to the simple pleasures of daily life, and Marcus found himself contributing in ways that surprised him. The quiet, reserved accountant was slowly giving way to someone more open and engaged, someone willing to share his opinions and emotions rather than keeping them safely hidden away. The story of Marcus Chen and Charlie the Golden Retriever had become part of Portland's folklore, retold in coffee shops and bars throughout the city as an example of ordinary heroism in an often cynical world. But for Marcus himself, the real transformation was not in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite that fear. That heroism was not about seeking recognition, but about responding to need wherever it arose. 6 months after the rescue, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable for the man he had been before that foggy morning on the bridge. He left his job at the accounting firm and used his savings to start a non-profit organization dedicated to rescuing animals from emergency situations. The work was unpredictable and often dangerous, requiring him to wade into floodwaters, climb into burning buildings, and rappel down cliffs to reach animals in distress. But it was also profoundly meaningful, connecting him to a purpose larger than himself and a community of people who shared his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. The organization grew slowly but steadily, attracting volunteers and donors who had been inspired by Marcus's story and wanted to contribute to similar rescue efforts. Dorothy Williams became one of the non-profit's most dedicated supporters, using her connections in the education community to organize fundraising events and awareness campaigns. Charlie, fully recovered from his ordeal, served as an unofficial mascot for the organization, his presence at events a living reminder of why the work mattered. Marcus and Sarah remarried on a sunny afternoon in May, exactly 1 year after the bridge incident that had changed everything. The ceremony was held in Dorothy's backyard, with Charlie serving as ring-bearer and dozens of friends and family members celebrating the couple's second chance at happiness. Sarah had come to understand that the man she had divorced for being too cautious was the same man who had jumped from a bridge without hesitation when someone needed help. The apparent contradiction had resolved itself into a more complex and complete picture of who Marcus really was. Someone who calculated risks carefully, but was willing to accept any risk when the stakes truly mattered. The local news stations covered the wedding as a feel-good follow-up to the original rescue story. But Marcus and Sarah barely noticed the cameras. They were too busy looking toward a future that seemed full of possibilities they had never imagined. Sarah had always wanted children, a dream that Marcus's risk-averse nature had made them postpone indefinitely. But the man who had saved Charlie was someone she trusted to protect and provide for a family, even in an uncertain world. As Marcus stood in Dorothy's garden, surrounded by the people who had become his chosen family, he reflected on the series of seemingly random events that had brought him to this moment. A traffic jam, a medical emergency, a split-second decision to act rather than observe, all of it combining to create a life he could never have planned or anticipated. The careful, predictable existence he had constructed for himself had been swept away as completely as if he had been caught in the Willamette River's current, replaced by something messier and more uncertain, but infinitely more alive. Dorothy raised a toast to the happy couple, her voice still slightly slurred from the lingering effects of her stroke, but her words clear and heartfelt. She spoke about the interconnectedness of all living things, the way that one act of courage could ripple outward to touch countless lives in ways both seen and unseen. Charlie barked his approval from his position at Marcus's feet, tail wagging, as if he understood that he had played a crucial role in bringing all these people together. The sun was setting over Portland as the celebration continued into the evening, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the river, where Marcus had once plunged into icy water to save a stranger's dog. The city spread out below them, home to millions of people living their own careful or careless lives, most of them unaware that their capacity for heroism remained untested and largely unknown. Marcus smiled as he watched Sarah laugh at something Dorothy had said, Charlie's head resting contentedly on his lap, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the moment of crisis that had revealed who he really was and who he could become. The man who had once worried about traffic delays and tax returns had been transformed into someone who understood that the most important decisions in life often come without warning, requiring not careful planning, but simple courage and the willingness to act when action is needed most.